Caleb Turner carried the war's scars in his silence, believing he'd buried his courage in Kandahar's dust. Yet, on a crisp October dusk in a sleepy Ohio town, fire roared through a crumbling duplex. An instinct overruled his resolve. He emerged from the inferno with Noah, a wide-eyed boy whose coughs echoed in Caleb's chest. In the sterile hospital corridor, Grace Pierce's 2 words, "He's yours," struck like shrapnel, reshaping the meaning of home forever. Late October in a small Midwestern town has a way of feeling both infinite and already gone. The air hangs heavier than it should, the sky a faded sheet that can't decide between gray and gold. Caleb Turner's boots press a slow rhythm into the cracked asphalt of County Road 7. Each step muffled by the thin drift of leaves skittering ahead of him. He runs the same route most afternoons, 3 miles out, 3 miles back, more to quiet the noise inside than to keep his body in shape. The hum of cicadas has long since faded for the year, replaced by the faint rustle of corn stalks left standing in brittle rows, waiting for a harvest that might not come. He wears an old Army PT shirt under a jacket patched at the elbows. Sweat darkens the collar despite the chill, the kind of sweat that comes from habit, not urgency. In the distance, the grain elevator rises above the town's modest skyline, if you can call 3 church steeples and a hardware store skyline. Caleb keeps his eyes fixed on that shape, because looking down at the empty sidewalks only reminds him of how much has changed. Storefronts he remembers lit and busy now sag under for lease signs. The diner where his mother used to work serves as a thrift store for donated clothes. Even the bar where he celebrated his 21st, back when he thought the world was his to claim, has its windows boarded, a single beer sign still faintly glowing behind dusty glass. The wind shifts, bringing with it the smell of wood smoke. At first, it blends into the background, part of the season's familiar palette. But this smoke is thicker, darker, carrying a bitter edge that doesn't belong to autumn. He slows without thinking, his breath visible in uneven bursts. Somewhere beyond the row of maple trees ahead, a sound breaks the quiet, something sharp, urgent. It's not the laughter of kids, not the slam of a screen door. It's higher-pitched, ragged, yelling. He stops at the bend where the road drops slightly toward a neighborhood of modest single-story homes. From here, the rooftops are barely visible, but above them a column of black smoke twists upward, fat and impatient, blotting out a slice of sky. The sight cuts through him in an odd, familiar way, like a memory of burning trash pits in the desert. Except this is no war zone. This is home, or at least what home has become. For a moment, he doesn't move. His hands rest on his hips, fingers pressing into the fabric as if to steady himself. The smoke rises, and with it something in his chest sinks. He knows the shape of disaster. He's lived inside it. But this is different. Over there are streets he's walked since he was a boy. Over there might be faces he's known, or maybe strangers who could have been neighbors if life had broken another way. Either way, the air smells of something lost. A gust drives the smoke toward him, bringing with it the unmistakable scent of burning insulation, scorched paint. The acrid tang that says the fire isn't just in the walls, it's in the bones of the place. He feels the smallest hesitation. Not from fear, but from that strange paralysis that comes when you know stepping forward will change you again. After all the years, after the friends who never came home, after the letters that stopped arriving, Caleb had told himself he was done charging toward what was already gone. Yet he stands there, eyes locked on the growing plume, and realizes there are 2 kinds of loss, the kind you can't touch and the kind happening right in front of you. The first you carry forever. The second demands you move. Somewhere in the distance, a voice rises, unsteady, breaking. He can't make out the words, but the tone is clear, pleading. The muscles in his legs twitch, and his breath comes faster. He imagines a kitchen table overturned, picture frames melting in their glass, the sound of someone calling into the heat. He thinks about all the people he couldn't save, names he hasn't spoken in years. The weight of them sits behind his ribs like stones. The world seems to narrow, the empty road under his boots, the brittle hiss of leaves, the smoke marking a place where, just minutes ago, life was still intact. Caleb takes one last breath of the cold air before it fills with fire, and steps forward, each stride pulling him away from the safety of standing still and toward the raw edge of whatever waits ahead. The sound hits him first, an ugly roar beneath the crackle, the sort of deep, consuming voice that fire uses when it has already taken hold. Caleb Turner rounds the corner into the neighborhood, his boots finding the sidewalk without thought. A handful of neighbors stand in a loose half-circle on the lawn across the street, their faces pale, eyes fixed on the two-story house, now split in half by flame. The bottom floor is already gone to the orange. The upper windows belch smoke that clings low to the eaves before lifting into the sky. He can feel the heat from here. It's a living thing, pushing against him, daring him to step closer. He scans the scene automatically, the way muscle memory tells him. Front porch collapsed inward. Power lines overhead still intact, but sagging, back gate hanging open. No sign of a fire crew yet. Someone shouts over the din, a man in a flannel shirt, his voice cracking. They're still inside. The words slice through the chaos. Caleb's chest tightens, a single thought anchoring in his mind. Not yet too late. He moves without deciding to. The edge of the crowd parts for him, the way strangers sometimes recognize intent. His jacket is unzipped halfway, and he yanks it free, tossing it to the grass as he climbs the front steps. The door hangs crooked on its hinges, paint blistering and peeling in strips. He forces it open with his shoulder. Smoke punches out, hot and wet, curling around his face and stinging his eyes. Inside, the light shifts to a suffocating dusk. He drops low, knees bending instinctively, pulling his shirt collar over his mouth and nose. The air tastes of ash and something acrid, melted plastic, burning varnish. Each breath is measured, shallow, the way he learned in another life far from here. The hallway stretches ahead, shadows flickering in jerks as the flames on the right wall hiss and climb. He sweeps the space with his eyes, framed photos crooked on the wall, their glass spiderweb from heat. One frame has fallen, the picture inside half-scorched, a smiling boy in a school portrait barely visible under soot. Caleb keeps moving, one hand brushing the wall to keep his bearings. A sound pulls him left, soft, almost swallowed by the fire's voice. A whimper. He follows it past an overturned chair, past a rug curling in on itself from the heat. The kitchen doorway gapes open, the room beyond glowing dim through the haze. And there, half hidden beneath a wooden table shoved against the wall, is a small shape curled in on itself. He drops to one knee, voice low, steady. Hey, the word comes out softer than he expects, meant to reassure more than to command. No response, but the trembling shape tightens, arms covering the head. He edges closer, the heat prickling his skin. I'm here, he says, leaning forward. You're safe now. It's a promise he can't yet guarantee, but one he has to say. Carefully, he reaches under the table. His hands find the slight weight of a child's shoulders. The boy doesn't resist. He's too far gone in a fear to do anything but let himself be lifted. Caleb gathers him close, feeling the heat radiating off his small body, the sharp tremors running through his limbs. The boy's shirt smells of smoke and something sweet, maybe syrup from a breakfast long since abandoned. His chin rests briefly against Caleb's collarbone, and then Caleb hears it. 2 words, barely a breath, almost lost in the roar, bad man. The syllables are feather-light, but they land heavy in Caleb's chest. They carry no explanation, no context, yet they drag with them a weight he knows all too well. The sound of trust stripped away, of something broken before it could ever set right. He pushes to his feet, shifting the boy against him so one arm can shield his head. The kitchen ceiling groans, a beam above, splitting with a pop. Embers fall like sparks from a grinding wheel, stinging the back of his neck. No time now. He turns toward the back door. Front's no longer an option, and keeps low, eyes scanning for falling debris. The boy's arms have found his neck now, holding on tight in a grip both desperate and certain. Caleb lowers his head against the heat, muscles in his back coiled as they move through the narrow hall. The back door looms ahead, paint blistered, glass panes rattling from the force of the fire behind them. He tries the knob. It turns. He shoulders through, the door swinging wide into a yard overrun with dry grass. The sudden rush of cooler air hits them both, but it's laced with the smell of burning wood. Behind them, a muffled boom shakes the ground, the roof giving way. A gasp ripples through the small crowd, now gathered beyond the fence. Caleb doesn't stop until his boots are on the far side. The boy still tight in his arms, head tucked into the hollow of his shoulder. He kneels then, easing the child onto a patch of grass, but keeping a hand on his small back. The boy's face is streaked with soot, eyes wide but unfocused. Caleb catches himself looking for injuries, scanning for burns, but the boy's voice, those two fragile words, keeps circling in his mind. Loud as any siren, the fire still talks behind them. But here, in this small circle of cool air and trampled grass, Caleb feels the world tilt. He doesn't know the boy, doesn't know who the bad man is. But in that whisper, he hears the echo of his own past. Moments when help came too late, when nobody stepped forward in time. He realizes, with the weight of the boy's trust pressing into his palm, that this time he will not be too late. The world outside the emergency room was all noise, sirens pulling up, clipped instructions from paramedics, the restless shuffle of bystanders who'd followed the ambulance from the fire. But inside, the hallway was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. Caleb Turner sat in a molded plastic chair against the wall, elbows resting on his knees, his jacket folded in his lap like something fragile. The sharp scent of disinfectant clung to the air, cutting through the fading smell of smoke still trapped in his clothes and hair. The linoleum floor reflected the fluorescent lights in a long, unbroken line, the kind of sterile brightness that had no warmth in it. Every so often, a set of footsteps would echo down the corridor. Nurses in soft-soled shoes, a gurney wheel squeaking, a door clicking shut somewhere down the line. But mostly, it was just the hum of the air system and the distant beep of machines behind closed doors. The stillness left too much space for thoughts to move in. He leaned forward, rubbing his palms together. Not from cold, but to keep them from curling into fists. The boy, Noah, they'd said, had been taken behind those swinging double doors more than 20 minutes ago. Caleb had watched as the ER team wheeled him away, an oxygen mask covering most of his face, a nurse's hand resting gently on his small shoulder. That was the last glimpse he'd had. He didn't know why he stayed. He could have given his statement to the police, left his name, and walked out. That's what a stranger would do. But the feel of those two words, bad man, was still etched into him, as if they'd been pressed there with heat. And the weight of the boy's arms around his neck hadn't left his skin. A man in a dark uniform walked past, sheriff's deputy, judging by the badge and the radio at his hip. Caleb's eyes followed him out of habit, noting the easy way he carried himself, the weight in his step. Military, maybe. The deputy didn't glance his way, just kept moving toward the front desk. Caleb shifted in his chair, stretching one leg out, then pulling it back in. His knees still ached from crouching in the kitchen, from lifting the boy and holding him tight through the smoke. He told himself it was just the exertion, but he knew better. The ache was older than that, something that had been sitting in him for years, waiting for an excuse to be felt again. From behind the closed ER doors came the muffled sound of a monitor alarm, then a nurse's calm voice calling for something Caleb didn't understand. He stared at the red warning light above the door. It glowed steady, indifferent, offering no clue about what was happening on the other side. His breathing slowed, then quickened without warning. He felt like he had in the minutes after certain firefights overseas. No immediate danger, yet every nerve tuned too sharply. Only this wasn't about him, and it wasn't about a war zone. This was a boy in a small-town hospital, and Caleb was powerless to do a thing about it. A pair of teenagers sat at the far end of the hall, whispering into their phones, glancing up whenever a nurse passed. One had a bandage across his forehead, the other clutched a hoodie in his lap. Caleb wondered if they'd been near the fire, if they'd seen the boy before he went in. He thought about asking, but the thought of speaking felt heavier than keeping still. Somewhere down the hall, an orderly pushed a mop bucket past, the faint tang of bleach trailing behind. Caleb's gaze followed the motion until it disappeared around the corner. His eyes returned to the double doors, as if staring hard enough might pull them open. He tried to remember the boy's face before the soot, before the mask, but the image kept shifting, partly Noah, partly other faces from years ago. Kids pulled from rubble, from wrecked cars, from situations that ended badly despite every effort. He learned long ago not to linger on those memories, but tonight they came without asking. The hum of the lights above seemed louder now, filling the space where a heartbeat should be. Caleb realized his hands were still resting on his knees, fingers splayed, as if bracing for impact. There was nothing to brace for, and yet everything in him was tight. The door at the far end of the hall swung open, and Sheriff Milton stepped through. His hair was more silver than Caleb remembered from high school, but his walk was the same, steady, deliberate. Milton glanced down the hall, spotted him, and gave the smallest nod before disappearing into an office across from the ER doors. No conversation, no questions, just a nod. Caleb watched the door close behind him. He thought about standing, about following, but his body stayed where it was. The chair's plastic edge dug into his back, anchoring him to the moment. Minutes stretched. Footsteps came and went. And still the red light above the ER doors burned on, steady and silent, while somewhere behind it a boy fought to breathe clean air again. Caleb lowered his eyes to his hands, noticing a faint tremor in his fingers, and told himself it was just from the cold. The ER doors finally swung open with a tired hiss, and the red warning light above them flicked off. A nurse stepped out first, pulling her mask down just far enough to be heard clearly. She moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who had already lived half a lifetime in fluorescent hallways like this. But when she spoke, her voice was calm. "He's stable now," she said to the officer stationed nearby. "No serious burns. Just mild smoke inhalation and, well, shock. He's quiet. Hasn't said much since you brought him in." Caleb kept his head down, letting the words sink in. Stable. Not hurt badly. It should have been enough to release the knot in his chest, but it didn't. The sound of quiet hung there like a weight. The nurse handed the officer a clipboard and disappeared back into the ER. The officer, a broad man in a dark jacket, flipped through a couple of pages, then glanced toward Caleb. "You the one who carried the boy out?" Caleb met his gaze briefly and nodded once. "Name's Noah Pierce," the officer said, eyes scanning the sheet again. "Mother's Grace Pierce." The name fell into Caleb's mind like a stone dropped into still water. No splash, just ripples spreading slow and wide. Grace Pierce. He didn't say anything at first. The corridor around him blurred, its white walls dimming in his mind as another picture took its place. A summer evening years ago. The town's annual fair strung up with yellow lights. He could see her at the lemonade stand, sunlight catching in her hair, smiling in a way that made you think she already knew every secret worth keeping. They'd talked for hours that night, leaning against the wooden fence behind the livestock pens, swapping dreams like kids who didn't know the world could break them. In that brief season, Grace had been the closest thing to home he'd had outside his mother's kitchen. They'd shared coffee at the corner diner, sat in his pickup under the wide prairie sky, talking about everything and nothing. Then the letter had come, orders to deploy, a place overseas he'd barely heard of. He'd left on a Wednesday. No proper goodbye, just a promise scribbled on a napkin. "I'll be back before the leaves turn." But the leaves had turned, fallen, and grown back again twice before he saw the town again. By then, she was gone. No note, no word, just gone. He told himself she'd moved on, found someone who could stay. And he'd buried her name in a long list of things he didn't revisit. Now, standing in this sterile hallway, the name had climbed out of that grave. Grace Pierce. It wasn't a common name around here. It couldn't be coincidence. The officer kept talking, but Caleb only half heard him. Something about trying to locate next of kin, neighbors not knowing much. The boy having lived in that house for less than 6 months. Each detail felt like a pebble dropped into that same still water, disturbing the surface, pulling up questions. Why was she here? Why the change of address? And where was she now, if her son had been alone in a burning house? Caleb's gaze drifted toward the ER doors again, as if the boy might reappear and somehow answer all of it without saying a word. But the hallway stayed empty. He leaned back against the wall, the cool paint pressing between his shoulder blades. The smell of smoke still clung to him, mixing strangely with the hospital's antiseptic. His pulse had slowed, but it was a restless rhythm, like a horse shifting in its stall. Grace Pierce. He tried saying it in his head, letting the syllables sit there, testing how they felt after all these years. It was the same name, but the world it belonged to was gone. Whatever had happened between then and now, it had shaped her life enough that her boy was here, in this hallway, with soot still in his hair. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, the rasp of stubble grounding him in the present. The questions would have to wait, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't just walk away. Not now. Not with that name hanging in the air like unfinished business. The officer glanced at him again, pen poised over his clipboard. "You know her?" Caleb's answer was measured, almost careful. "Name sounds familiar." It was the truth, though not the whole of it. And for now, that was all he could give. The officer gave a short nod and returned to his notes. Caleb turned his eyes back to the double doors, listening to the faint hum of the ER beyond. Grace Pierce. A name he'd once thought might be part of his future was now tangled in the smoke and heat of this night. And whatever the story was, he knew it had just pulled him back into something he thought he'd left behind forever. 2 days passed before Caleb saw the boy again. In that time, the fire had already been reduced to a smudge of blackened wood and wet ash on the edge of town, the kind of sight people drove past slower than usual, their eyes skimming over it, but never stopping. The official word was that Noah Pierce was recovering well, stable, breathing fine, eating a little, but the word quiet kept surfacing in every update. Quiet in a way that meant more than shyness. Quiet like someone who had learned that speaking only made things worse. Caleb didn't ask for permission to visit. He simply showed up at the hospital late in the afternoon, the sun already low enough to send amber light across the parking lot. Inside, the air was warmer than it needed to be, heavy with that faint sweet scent of powdered soap and cafeteria coffee. A nurse recognized him from the night of the fire and nodded toward a short hallway off the main ward. Into the hall. Room 6. She didn't ask why he was there, and he didn't offer a reason. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. The blinds were half closed, letting in slats of light that striped the cream-colored walls. Noah was perched on the edge of the bed, legs dangling above the floor. His sneakers were neatly placed side by side on the tile, laces untied. Beside him sat a plastic tray table, and on it, a stack of printer paper and a box of colored pencils worn down to stubs. The boy's head was bent forward, curls falling into his eyes as he worked the red pencil back and forth across the page. Caleb stepped inside slowly, letting the door swing shut behind him with a muffled click. Noah didn't look up. The soft scratch of pencil on paper filled the small room. Caleb moved to the chair in the corner, lowering himself into it without making the kind of noise that would feel like intrusion. He sat there for a while, watching the boy's hand move, short, firm strokes that seemed to come from memory rather than imagination. After a minute, Noah set the red pencil down and reached for a black one, tracing over lines already drawn. Caleb leaned forward just enough to catch the edges of the picture, the outline of a house. Jagged flames pouring from the windows, a figure standing in the foreground. The figure was tall, its face marked by 2 dark slashes for eyes, the hands little more than block shapes. One of those hands held a small orange rectangle. Fire, crudely drawn but unmistakable. The boy's hand hesitated over the page, then pressed harder, darkening the black around the figure's head until it was almost a void. Caleb felt the muscles in his shoulders tighten. He'd seen children draw their nightmares before, overseas, in towns where the sound of engines or gunfire could send them scrambling under tables. But this was here, in a quiet Midwestern hospital room, and the distance between the two places suddenly felt paper-thin. Noah slid the paper to the side and reached for a fresh sheet. He didn't glance at Caleb, but his movements had a kind of deliberate precision, as though the act of drawing itself was more important than who might be watching. He picked up a yellow pencil and began outlining something else, a smaller figure this time, positioned inside the burning house, almost swallowed by the red lines around it. Caleb shifted in his chair, the legs creaking softly. The boy's head tilted, just enough to let him know he'd been heard. But still, Noah kept working. When the second drawing was finished, he set the pencil down and pushed the paper away, letting it overlap the first. Then, without looking at Caleb, he reached for another sheet. It was then Caleb realized this wasn't idle doodling. It was a record. Each page another fragment of something the boy couldn't, or wouldn't, say out loud. On impulse, Caleb reached forward and drew the first picture toward him. He studied it, tracing the jagged lines of flame, the heavy black face, the small flick of orange in the figure's hand. It was simple, yes, but not vague. Whoever this bad man was, Noah remembered him clearly enough to commit him to paper. The boy finally looked up, his eyes landing on the paper in Caleb's hands. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Noah's gaze dropped back to the blank sheet in front of him, and he picked up the red pencil again. Caleb set the picture back, down gently, aligning it with the others as if that might preserve something. He leaned back in his chair, the springs sighing under his weight, and let the silence stretch between them. Sometimes he knew silence was the only safe ground someone had left. Outside the window, the late-day sun shifted, and the shadows from the blinds crept across the boy's arm. He didn't seem to notice. His whole world, for now, was in those lines and colors. And for reasons Caleb didn't yet understand, he felt himself pulled into it, into the stillness, into the weight of what wasn't being said, into the quiet urgency of a child's first attempt to make someone else see what he had seen. Whatever had started in that burning house hadn't ended with the fire hoses. And here in room 6, with the smell of waxy pencilwood mixing with a faint trace of smoke still clinging to the boy's hair, Caleb felt the first stirrings of a truth that would not leave him alone. Caleb stayed in the chair long after the nurses might have expected a visitor to leave. The boy's pencils moved in steady rhythm, red for the flames, black for the shadows, orange for the thing in a man's hand. Each sheet seemed to circle back to the same images: a house, a fire, a figure. The variations were small. Sometimes the man stood closer, sometimes farther away, but the core remained unchanged. It wasn't random. It wasn't the wandering imagination of a child passing time. This was a loop, a memory playing over and over in a form that Noah could control. Caleb knew enough about the mind after years of service to recognize the pattern. You draw what you can't speak. You draw because it's safer than seeing it play out behind your eyes. He shifted forward, resting his forearms on his knees, eyes tracing the lines on the latest page. The figure's face was always the same, a block of dark scribble where features should be, heavy and impenetrable. But it wasn't the darkness that bothered him most, it was the posture. The stiff angle of the shoulders, the way the legs were planted, wide apart like someone claiming the ground in front of him. That stance wasn't accidental. Caleb's mind began running through questions without answers. Who was the man? Why would he be standing there, so close to a house on fire, doing nothing? Or worse, starting it? And why would a boy this young draw him so clearly, over and over? Noah didn't look at him, but Caleb could feel the boy's awareness. The subtle way his shoulders tensed whenever Caleb's gaze lingered too long on the drawings. Not fear of the soldier in the chair, but fear that the pictures might be taken away before they could be finished. One of the nurses came in quietly, setting a paper cup of juice on the tray table. Keep the lid on until you're ready. Okay, she murmured to Noah, but her eyes flicked to Caleb, curious. He gave a small nod, and she slipped out again. The boy didn't touch the juice. He picked up the black pencil again, adding weight to the shadow behind the figure, filling the space until it almost swallowed the page. Caleb watched his small fingers grip the pencil so tightly the knuckles whitened. A memory from another life pressed in, an interpreter in a dusty Afghan village, telling Caleb that the boy they'd just met wouldn't speak because the man who heard him still walked free in the same streets. Caleb had carried that silence with him for years, and now, here it was again, in a different language, drawn instead of spoken. The suspicion began to harden. Fires didn't start themselves, and the look in the boy's eyes, what little Caleb saw of it, held none of the confusion you might expect from a child caught in an accident. It was focused, as if the details were etched too deep to blur. Caleb leaned back slightly, eyes drifting to the wall clock above the door. The minute hand inched forward, outside the blinds. The light had shifted from amber to gray. Visiting hours would end soon, and he still didn't know why he was here, only that leaving felt like the wrong thing to do. Noah placed the finished drawing on top of the stack and slid it toward the far edge of the table, as though distancing himself from it. Caleb resisted the urge to reach for it again. Instead, he studied the boy's face, still soft with youth, but wearing an expression far older than it should. It was in that moment, watching the quiet precision of a child rebuilding the same scene for the 5th time, that Caleb felt the line inside him move. This wasn't just a rescue. This wasn't a moment that would end with a handshake and a thank you. Something in these pages connected to a truth that had teeth. And if the boy was the only one who knew it, then Caleb, whether he meant to or not, was already involved. The suspicion wasn't just a flicker anymore. It was a slow, steady burn, the kind you felt before you even saw the flames. When he finally stood to leave, Noah didn't look up, but his hand paused mid-stroke, the pencil hovering over the page for the briefest second. Caleb took that pause with him into the hallway, a silent confirmation that the boy knew he had been understood, at least a little, and that understanding was enough to keep Caleb's feet from carrying him too far from room 6 in the days ahead. The drawings stayed with Caleb through the night. Even after he'd left the hospital, their shapes and colors kept resurfacing, flashing into his mind with the same stubborn clarity as road signs on a long, empty highway. The house, the fire, the man. Always the man. He didn't sleep much. A soldier's insomnia had been his unwelcome companion for years, but this was different. Each time his eyes closed, he saw the blacked-out face from Noah's pictures, the crooked stance, the small orange block of flame in one hand. In the quiet, those images seemed less like a child's scrawl and more like testimony. By morning, the question of what to do had already answered itself. He didn't want to guess. He wanted someone with a badge and the authority to dig where he couldn't. That meant Sheriff Milton. The sheriff's office occupied a narrow brick building just off Main Street, its windows squared and utilitarian. Caleb hadn't set foot inside since returning to town, though he'd passed it often enough to notice the fresh coat of paint on the front door and the new flag snapping from the pole out front. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. The walls were lined with framed photographs. Softball teams the department had sponsored, ribbon cuttings from years past, a few news clippings about local fundraisers. It all felt smaller than he remembered, the way most places did after you'd seen too much elsewhere. Sheriff Milton was behind his desk when Caleb stepped in, his glasses low on his nose as he read a file. He looked up once, twice, before recognition settled. "Caleb Turner," he said, voice carrying that flat mix of surprise and welcome. "Didn't know you were back." Caleb didn't bother with small talk. "It's about the boy from the fire, Noah." He set his folded jacket on the edge of the desk, then carefully pulled the papers from inside, for drawings he'd managed to ask the nurse to photocopy before leaving the hospital. He laid them out in a row, smoothing the creases. Milton's eyes moved over each one, his expression sharpening almost imperceptibly. "These his..." "Every one," Caleb said. "I was there while he made them." He didn't say much, just kept drawing the same scene, same man, over and over. He tapped the first page lightly, always holding that. Milton leaned forward, studying the crude orange shape in the figure's hand. "Lighter. Looks like it to me," Caleb said. He hesitated, then added, "And he called someone bad man the night I pulled him out." Whispered it. "I think this is who he meant." The sheriff sat back, exhaling through his nose. Arson's a heavy thing to pin on someone, especially through a kid's drawings. "I know," Caleb said. His tone wasn't defensive, just steady. "But I've seen enough to know when a kid's telling you what happened the only way he can. That fire wasn't random." For a moment, Milton didn't respond. He gathered the drawings into a neat stack, aligning the edges as if that order might make the situation cleaner. Then he set them down again, splayed slightly apart. "We got a preliminary report from the fire chief. Structural collapse on the lower floor started near the kitchen. No signs yet of faulty wiring. They're still combing through what's left. If there's accelerant in the debris, that'll tell us more." Caleb nodded. It was something at least, but the gnawing feeling in his gut didn't ease. "And the mother?" "Grace Pierce. Still missing?" Milton said. "We put out a notice. Neighbors say they kept to themselves. Moved in about 6 months ago. Nobody's sure where from." Caleb let the name settle in the air again. Grace Pierce. 6 months in that house, now burned nearly to the ground. Her son alive, drawing the same man over and over. "I figured you'd want to see these," he said finally, nodding toward the papers. Milton's gaze met his, something unspoken passing between them. Shared years in the same town. Shared understanding of how quickly trouble could find its way into quiet places. "I do," the sheriff said, "and I'll keep them. They'll go in a file." But Caleb, he paused, though he knew himself well enough to understand it wouldn't hold him back if the moment came. He brought the man the pieces. Now he had to see if anyone would put them together before the trail cooled. When he stepped back out into the morning light, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from someone's stove. It was a gentler scent than the acrid burn from 2 nights ago, but it still curled in his lungs the same way. He turned toward the truck, his mind replaying the drawings in sequence. The stance of the man, the unwavering detail of the flame. The sheriff had the papers now, but the weight of them still rode with Caleb as he pulled out of the parking lot. As if handing them over hadn't lessened the responsibility, only spread it. The following afternoon, a thin curtain of cloud dulled the sun to a pale disk, casting the town in that dim, colorless light that made every surface look older. Caleb Turner was back at the sheriff's office, a coffee in hand he hadn't sipped from, waiting in the narrow front lobby while the murmur of phones and paper shuffling carried from the back. Sheriff Milton emerged from a side room, a folded map in one hand, his reading glasses perched halfway down his nose. "We've got something," he said without preamble, tilting his head for Caleb to follow. Inside Milton's cramped office, the map was spread across the desk. The surface was already cluttered, stacks of case files, a coffee mug ringed with stains, a jar of mismatched pens. Milton smoothed the map with the flat of his palm, tracing a thick finger along a red line that marked County Road 12. "Volunteer search teams found tire impressions just off the road here," he said, tapping a spot where the town's northern edge gave way to low woods. Dirt turnout. Not much else out there except a game trail and an old logging path. Caleb stepped closer, noting the faint pencil marks circling the area. "From the night of the fire?" "Best guess," Milton said. "Ground soft from last week's rain. The impressions are fresh enough to be worth looking at. Dual tread pattern, decent width, maybe a pickup, maybe an SUV. And one more thing." He reached for a manila envelope and slid out a photograph. The image showed a patch of churned dirt leading into undergrowth. The tire tracks were clear, angling toward the shadowed mouth of trees. Beside them, a set of footprints, adult-sized. Boot tread worn down smooth, ran parallel for several yards before vanishing into leaf litter. Caleb studied the photo, the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves almost rising in his memory. He'd followed trails like this in another life, different terrain, different dangers, but the same silent invitation. Come see where this leads. Milton leaned back in his chair. Could be nothing. Could be someone out there hunting early in the season. But it's close enough to the timeline to check. "My deputy's tied up on another call. You feel like stretching your legs?" Caleb didn't bother hiding his answer. "I'll go." An hour later, he was standing at the edge of that same turnout, the sound of his truck cooling behind him. The air was sharper here, eyes scanning ahead for the break in foliage that marked the old logging path. The canopies swallowed the light in patches, and the air grew cooler. Twigs snapped under his boots, loud in the hush. Every so often he'd catch a glimpse of the boot prints alongside the tire marks, the weight of the steps uneven, as if the person had been moving quickly or carrying something. 100 yards in, the path widened just enough for a vehicle to have turned. Caleb found the spot where the tracks looped in a tight half circle, the churned mud still holding the shape of the tread. Beyond that, the path narrowed again, impassable for anything larger than a motorcycle. He stood there for a while, listening. The forest was quiet except for a woodpecker tapping somewhere deeper in. No voices, no Indians. But the silence didn't feel empty. It felt as if it was holding its breath. Near the turnaround, a small piece of fabric lay half buried in mud. Caleb bent to pick it up, rubbing the wet dirt between his fingers until the cloth came clean enough to see the pattern. Pale blue, with a faint outline of a star. A scrap from a child's pajama leg, maybe. It was no bigger than his palm. He slipped it into his jacket pocket, his thumb brushing over it once before he started back toward the road. The sun was lower now, the clouds breaking just enough to throw streaks of light across the tree trunks. Caleb walked slower on the return, marking each bend in the path in his mind. If someone had been here the night of the fire, they'd chosen this place for a reason, hidden enough to avoid attention, close enough to get back to town in minutes. Back at his truck, the sheriff would want to know about the fabric. But Caleb already knew he wouldn't let this go, not until he'd seen where all the tracks, tire and otherwise, truly ended. By the time Caleb reached the far side of town, the sky had bruised to the color of old denim, with strips of pale gold lingering low over the fields. The road north was nearly empty. Hands wrapped tight around a chipped mug. Her hair was pulled back in a way that tried to hide how much of it was gone to uneven lengths. The sleeves of her sweatshirt were stretched past her wrists, the fabric frayed. There was something about the slope of her shoulders, an almost imperceptible inward curl, that made Caleb certain before she even lifted her head. Grace Pierce. She looked up when he approached, her eyes narrowing, not in recognition, but in the wary reflex of someone who has learned to measure every stranger. Her gaze lingered on the scar at his temple, the rough wear of his jacket, before drifting back to the window, as if deciding whether to bolt. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly, stopping just short of her booth. It wasn't a line. It was a truth he needed her to believe before anything else. Her fingers tightened around the mug. "Do I know you?" Her voice was thin, almost lost beneath the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. "No," Caleb admitted, "but I know your son." That made her look at him, sharp and direct. A flicker of something crossed her face. Hope, fear, both tangled. "No, He nodded. He's safe. He's at the hospital in town. The mug trembled slightly in her hands, and she set it down before it slipped. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Caleb slid into the opposite seat, lowering his voice. Who said that? Grace's eyes darted toward the door, then back to him. Dale. They took me when I tried to leave. Said Noah would be better off if I disappeared. Her words were clipped. The way a person speaks when there's too much to explain and no safe way to explain it. Caleb didn't press yet. He could see the strain in her, the kind that came from weeks or months of running on fear alone. Can you leave with me now? He asked. She hesitated, her gaze moving to the plate glass window. Outside, the gravel lot reflected the diner's neon in scattered puddles. Somewhere beyond the forest, a truck gear shifted down the highway. Grace pulled her sleeves further over her hands and gave the smallest nod. Caleb reached into his jacket and laid a 20 on the table. Not for the coffee, but to keep the waitress from remembering more than she had to. As they stepped outside, the air bit colder, the wind lifting strands of Grace's hair. She looked smaller out here, her frame swallowed in the sweatshirt, her steps cautious like she wasn't used to open space. When they reached the truck, she stopped short, glancing north where the road vanished into the trees. If we go back, she said softly, he'll find us. Caleb opened the passenger door. Then we make sure he doesn't. She climbed in without another word, her hands folded tight in her lap. As he pulled onto the road, the diner's glow faded behind them, replaced by the rhythm of tires on asphalt and the faint rattle of something in the glove box. Grace leaned her head against the window, watching the fields pass in streaks of muted color. Caleb kept his eyes on the road, but in the glass he could see her reflection, drawn, exhausted, yet holding the fragile edge of resolve. Neither of them spoke the rest of the drive, and in that silence Caleb felt the weight of what was now his to carry. He'd found her. A buzzing sign out front read vacancy, in 2 letters and a half-lit shadow of the rest. It wasn't much, but it was far enough from the main road to keep eyes from lingering. He parked beneath a crooked light pole and let the engine idle for a moment. Grace hadn't moved since they left the diner, still folded into herself in the passenger seat, hands tucked into the long sleeves of her sweatshirt. In the yellow wash of the lot light, her profile looked carved from something brittle. Inside, the room was small, the kind of space where the heater clunked awake like an old man, clearing his throat. Caleb locked the door, checked the bolt twice, then drew the thin curtains across the single window. Grace stood near the bed, as if waiting for permission to sit. You can relax, he said quietly, pulling a chair from the corner. But he knew the words meant little. Relaxation wasn't something you could ask of someone who'd been living like prey. For a while, the only sounds were the low hum of the heater and the faint whistle of wind through the bathroom vent. Caleb busied himself with the coffee maker on the dresser, an ancient thing that groaned at the effort, but his eyes stayed on her reflection in the mirror. She was looking at the floor, the hem of her sleeve twisting in her fingers. When the coffee was done, he set a cup in front of her, steam curled between them. Grace wrapped her hands around it, as if the heat might anchor her. They kept me in a house outside Carver's Mill, she said finally, her voice flat. Windows boarded, doors locked from the outside. If I made noise, Dale would. She stopped, swallowing whatever memory had caught her throat. They told me Noah was somewhere safe. Said if I did what I was told, he'd be cared for. Caleb listened without interruption. Her eyes didn't meet his. They stayed fixed on the ripple of coffee in her cup, on anything that wasn't a face. After a while, I stopped asking, she continued. Stop fighting. You start thinking maybe they're right. Maybe you're the problem. And when you believe that, you don't even need the locks anymore. A gust rattled the window pane. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. How did you get out? One of Dale's people got sloppy. Left the back latch undone. I waited until the house was quiet and walked out. I didn't have a plan, just kept moving. She gave a hollow half-smile. I thought I'd die before I found anyone who believed me. Caleb didn't tell her he believed her from the first moment. Some truths didn't need declaring. Instead, he asked, why north? Why here? She hesitated, then drew a crumpled envelope from her pocket. It was addressed in looping handwriting, the ink smudged at the corners. I had a sister once. Haven't seen her in years. She sent this months ago. Said if I ever needed to disappear, she'd meet me at the old diner. Caleb recognized the desperation of half-formed plans, the kind born in captivity where options narrowed to instinct. He also recognized the danger. If her sister knew the meeting point, Dale could too. "You're not going back there," he said, a soft rhythm beneath the heater's hum. He looked toward the curtained window, to the darkness beyond it, and thought about the locked doors she'd lived behind. He thought about the boy waiting in the hospital, about the way Noah's small hands had clung to him in the smoke. And he thought about Dale Ross, somewhere out there, counting on those locks to keep his world in place. Caleb's jaw tightened. Some doors didn't just need unlocking, they needed to be kicked in. Morning came without ceremony, no bright wash of light. Just the gradual thinning of darkness until the world was the color of wet newspaper. Caleb sat in the same chair he'd occupied most of the night, his elbows resting on his knees, a paper cup of coffee cooling between his palms. Grace was still asleep, her shape curled under the thin motel blanket. She had not moved much, except once near dawn, when she shifted and murmured something too soft for him to catch. The heater had stopped at some point, leaving the air with a damp chill. Caleb stood, careful not to wake her, and crossed to the window. He moved the curtain just enough to peer out. The parking lot was nearly empty. A single semi idled near the far exit, its exhaust drifting like pale breath into the cold. He glanced down at the space beneath the light pole where his truck sat. Nothing unusual, until his eyes caught the faintest smear of mud along the driver's side door handle. The kind of thing you might miss if you weren't used to noticing small, out-of-place details. Something in his gut told him it hadn't been there last night. Caleb set down his coffee and moved outside. The morning air bit at his face. He ran a finger over the smear. The mud was still damp, fresher than it should have been. His boots left prints as he stepped back, and he found himself comparing them to another set leading away from the truck, looping toward the service road at the back of the property. The prints were small, deliberate, someone walking in measured steps, as if mindful of noise. The trail broke at the gravel edge and disappeared into the weeds. He returned to the room quietly. Grace was sitting up now, hair mussed, eyes unfocused in the slow process of waking. Caleb studied her face, not for guilt, but for signs of something else, fear, resolve. Her hands were busy twisting the corner of the blanket. Caleb didn't press. Instead, he sat back in the chair and listened to the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It had a hum to it. What little she owned was already arranged for a quick grab and go. Sweatshirt on top, envelope tucked in an outer pocket, shoes positioned beside the bag with laces loose. She caught him looking, and for a flicker of a moment, there was no guarded mask, just raw honesty. "I can't stay in one place too long," she said, almost apologetically. Caleb let the words hang there. He knew they came from survival, from the reflex of a cornered animal. The problem was, running again would lead her straight back into the shadows she'd barely escaped. Outside, a siren wailed faintly in the distance, then faded into the hum of morning traffic. Grace moved toward the bathroom, and Caleb used the moment to step outside again. This time, he walked the service road. At the far end, behind a tangle of chain link and wild vines, he found a section of fence bent just enough for a person to slip through. Caught in the twist of metal was a shred of flannel, red and black, the fabric damp from the night air. Dale Ross favored shirts like that. Caleb had seen one slung over a chair in the background of a photo Noah had drawn. He stood there longer than necessary, the cold biting through his jacket, his breath visible. Grace wasn't just running from habit. Someone had been here. Someone close enough to leave mud on his truck and a message in the dirt. "We know where you are." By the time Caleb returned to the room. But she didn't reach for the bag again. That for now was enough. The heater kicked on with a clunk, filling the silence. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain, a reminder that the weather, like people, could turn with little warning. Caleb stayed by the door, his eyes on the parking lot beyond the curtain, knowing the signs of escape weren't just in the mud or the bent fence. They were in the way Grace breathed, like someone who still measured every moment by how quickly she could disappear. And that meant they had less time than he'd thought. The fall festival had always been the kind of thing you could set your watch by. Same weekend every year. Same weathered bunting strung across Main Street. Same smell of fried dough and kettle corn clinging to the air. But this year, for Caleb, her small frame nearly swallowed in the oversized hoodie she wore. She didn't look at the stalls or the rides. Her eyes moved the way a deer's did in hunting season, restless, darting from face to face, always searching for the outline she feared most. Caleb's gaze swept over the crowd in slow arcs. Years of patrols had taught him not to look like he was searching, to let his eyes drift and settle, then drift again. Somewhere near the edge of the square by the corn dog stand, he caught the flash of red and black flannel. A tall shape moved with the easy looseness of someone sure they wouldn't be touched in public. Dale Ross. The man was older than the last time Caleb had seen him. But the shoulders were the same, broad, rolled slightly forward as if always about to push through a door uninvited. Caleb saw the way he scanned the crowd, not with curiosity, but with ownership. Grace stiffened beside him. Her fingers tightened around his hand until he felt the bones press against his skin. "Stay behind me," Caleb said low, not stopping his forward motion. Ross didn't notice him at first. He was too focused on the small prize ticket booth, leaning against the counter like he had all the time in the world. But when Caleb closed the distance, weaving through the tide of bodies, Ross turned. Recognition was instant. His smirk didn't fade, but his posture changed, shifting weight like a man preparing to bolt. Caleb knew he couldn't chase him through a festival without causing a scene. He also knew he couldn't let him melt back into the crowd. So he closed the last few yards in 3 steady strides, reached out, and gripped Ross's wrist hard enough to stop movement cold. "Let go," Ross growled, his voice a rasp that barely carried over the music. But Caleb didn't. The crowd around them kept flowing, some glancing over, most too absorbed in their own errands to notice the tension coiling between 2 men in the middle of Main Street. "You've been following her," Caleb said, his voice even. "It ends here." Ross tried to twist free, but Caleb used his other hand to push him back against the booth counter. The impact drew a startled yelp from the ticket seller, and that, finally, turned heads. A mother tugged her child away. A man carrying a paper plate of funnel cake stopped mid-step. The shift in the crowd was immediate. People edged back, leaving a loose ring of open space. Sheriff Milton was among them. Caleb spotted him pushing through from the far side, his hat tipped back. Eyes narrowed. Ross's smirk returned, but it was thinner now. "You think you can make a scene and come out clean?" he asked, low enough for only Caleb to hear. Caleb didn't answer. He tightened his grip, enough to force Ross's balance off center. And then Milton was there, his presence filling the gap between them, one hand already on Ross's shoulder. "What's going on here?" "This morning. Now here." Milton's expression didn't change much, but his grip on Ross tightened. "Let's go have a talk," he said, guiding Ross toward the edge of the crowd. Ross threw a look over his shoulder, part threat, part promise, but he didn't fight. "Not here, not now." Grace stayed still, her hoodie's hood pulled low, until Ross and the sheriff were swallowed by the movement toward the courthouse steps. Only then did her shoulders loosen a fraction. The music from the bandstand swelled again, a waltz that felt wildly out of place after the last 5 minutes. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. Caleb kept his eyes on the path Ross had taken, knowing this wasn't over. In the shifting press of the crowd, he felt the fragile line between safety and danger, and how easily it could snap. When he finally moved, it was to steer Grace toward the quiet end of the street, away from the smell of fried food and the glances of strangers who had seen more than they understood. The festival went on behind them, oblivious. But Caleb carried the weight of the moment like a stone in his pocket, a reminder that even in the open, among neighbors and music, the hunt could still close in. The night after the festival settled into a stillness that only small towns seemed to know. Outside the motel, the street lamp's yellow light bled onto the empty sidewalk, casting slow-moving moth shadows across the cracked concrete. Caleb sat alone at the small table by the window, a coffee mug cooling untouched at his elbow, his pen resting against a page that had been started and abandoned more times than he cared to count. The paper in front of him was creased from folding and unfolding, its top half crowded with words he wasn't sure he meant anymore. It had begun as a report, just the facts like he'd been trained to write. But somewhere between the second and third paragraph, his handwriting had softened, his sentences had stretched out. The "Dear Grace" at the top had been crossed out and replaced with "Dear Noah," then crossed out again. Grace was asleep in the other bed, her small breaths slow and steady. The hoodies she wore like armor were folded neatly on the chair. She had barely spoken since the takedown at the festival, except to ask if the sheriff had locked Ross away. Caleb had told her yes, though he didn't know if it was true. In a place like this, locks could be undone by too many familiar hands. He turned his gaze back to the letter. It was meant for Dale Ross, though he doubted the man could be reached by words on paper. Still, there was something in Caleb that needed to try, some thin strand of discipline from his service years that demanded he put his thoughts into lines and leave them somewhere outside his own head. He wrote slowly, the tip of the pen scratching against the motel's complimentary stationery. You left a trail without realizing it. Maybe you thought fear made people blind. But fear sharpens edges. It makes a person see the shadow before the shape. She saw you, Dale, and now so do I. The words weren't elegant, but they carried the weight he intended. He let the pen hover before adding, if you care about your own skin, you'll stay gone. You come near her again, there won't be a crowd to watch what happens next. He stopped there, reading it over. The sentences were tight, each one a small nod of controlled anger. But behind them was something else, an exhaustion that had been building since the night of the fire, maybe longer. He didn't want to spend the rest of his life sending warnings. He didn't want Grace to grow up in a world where men like Ross could circle back like storms. From the bed, Grace shifted in her sleep, the blankets rustling. Caleb set the pen down, pressing his palms over his eyes until he saw the patterns of blood vessels in the darkness. He had half a mind to fold the letter, slip it into an envelope, and hand it to Milton first thing in the morning. But he knew the sheriff's advice before it was given. Let it go. Don't poke the bear. Small towns ran on that kind of counsel. Stay quiet. Keep your head down. Trust the quiet to hold. But Caleb had lived through too many nights where quiet only meant someone else was doing the harm out of sight. He reached for the mug, took a sip of coffee that had gone lukewarm, and stared at the letter again. His handwriting looked older than it should, the loops and angles pulled tight like someone bracing against wind. He folded the paper once, twice, and slid it into the top drawer of the nightstand. Not sent, not torn up either. Outside, a car passed slow along the street, tires whispering against asphalt. The sound faded until there was nothing but the low hum of the motel's old fridge. Caleb stood, crossed the room, and pulled the curtains shut. The letter would stay where it was for now, heavy enough in its silence to remind him of unfinished business. Morning would bring choices about Grace, about Ross, about how far a man was willing to go when he'd already walked through fire once. Caleb sat back down, leaned his forearms on the table, and looked at the blank sheet beneath the discarded one. He didn't pick up the pen this time. Some words could wait. But the weight in his chest told him they wouldn't wait forever. Morning broke slow, the way it often does after a night, when sleep only comes in shallow drafts. The motel curtains leaked pale light across the room, and Caleb woke to the faint creak of the other bed. Grace was already sitting up, her hair tangled from sleep. Her knees pulled to her chest like she was bracing against a wind only she could feel. Caleb swung his legs over the edge of his bed, the cool linoleum biting through his socks. He didn't speak right away. He'd learned in the service, and long before, that some mornings needed space more than sound. Grace's eyes flicked toward him, then to the window, then back to her own knees. There was a hesitation there, as if she'd been rehearsing something in her mind all night. When it came, it was small, just 3 words, barely above a whisper. He's my dad. Caleb felt it before he understood it, like a body blow that knocks the air out before you can name the pain. His first thought was of the man's face in the firelight. Ross's jaw set in that ugly smirk, the way his eyes had scanned the chaos for control. Blood ties were one thing. The kind of man Ross was another entirely. Grace didn't look at him when she said it again, slower this time, as if repetition might soften the truth. Noah's my dad. Her voice had that same flatness he'd heard from soldiers reading casualty lists aloud. Facts stripped of emotion, because to feel it was to break under it. He sat back, the motel chair creaking beneath him. The name, Noah, pulled something from deep in his memory, something from before the fire, before the hospital. He'd heard it once, years ago. A girl with Ross's blood in her veins, but a look in her eyes that didn't belong to that man. There was steel there and hurt. And something else, a flicker of wanting to believe she wasn't defined by where she came from. Caleb rubbed a hand over his face, buying himself the seconds he needed to steady his voice. Grace, he said finally, the word heavier than it should have been. That doesn't make him your family. Not if he stopped himself. The line between truth and cruelty was thin, and he didn't want to cross it before she was ready to hear it. She met his gaze then, chin lifting slightly. You don't have to tell me what he is. I know. There was no heat in it. No teenage defiance. Just the simple weight of someone who had lived too much of their life seeing clearly. But I needed you to know. The silence stretched after that. Long enough for the hum of the motel's fridge to become a kind of background heartbeat. Caleb thought about the letter in the drawer, about the warning he'd written but not sent. He wondered if Ross already knew Grace was talking. Men like him kept their own networks, their own ways of finding out what they needed to stay in control. Caleb's instinct was to protect, to put miles between them and Ross. But another part of him, one he didn't often let out into daylight, knew that running wasn't the same as safety. If Ross wanted to reclaim what he saw as his, he'd keep looking until he found her. Grace reached over to the nightstand and picked up the small silver locket she'd been carrying since the night of the fire. She opened it, glanced at the tiny photograph inside, then snapped it shut again. I don't remember him, she said. Not really. Just a shadow. A voice when I was little. That's it. Caleb leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. That's enough, he said quietly. Sometimes that's all you need to decide which way to walk. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something, approval, maybe, or proof that she wasn't alone in this. When she seemed to find it, she nodded once, almost to herself. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the main road, carrying the day forward whether they were ready for it or not. Caleb stood, crossed to the drawer, and pulled out the folded letter. He didn't open it, just slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Grace noticed, but didn't ask. Some questions could wait until the ground between them felt steadier. They checked out of the motel without speaking much, the air between them not tense, but heavy with the knowledge they now shared. As they stepped into the morning, Caleb found himself scanning the street corners, the parked cars, the open doorways, looking for a figure he half expected to see. Grace walked beside him, her steps measured, the locket swinging gently against her chest. Blood was a fact, he thought, but family, that was a choice. And as they moved toward the truck, he felt the first quiet thread of resolve coil tight inside him. Whatever Ross saw when he looked at Grace, it wouldn't be his to claim again. The first morning in Caleb's house came without fanfare. No clinking of coffee mugs, no radio humming in the kitchen, no smell of bacon curling through the air. Just the slow, gray seep of dawn through the thin curtains and the creak of an old frame as Grace shifted under a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. Caleb was already awake. He'd been up for an hour, sitting at the kitchen table with a chipped mug of black coffee, watching the steam coil up and vanish. Years in the service had left him with an inner clock that ignored the calendar and the comfort of civilian hours. But this morning, it wasn't duty that woke him. It was the awareness that there was someone else breathing under his roof, someone who needed the steadiness of a man who wasn't going to leave without warning. The house was still the kind that carried sound like a whisper between rooms. Grace's light footsteps on the hallway boards came to him before she appeared, hair still mussed from sleep, wearing an old sweatshirt he'd found folded in the bottom of a drawer. She didn't say good morning, but she lingered in the doorway, scanning the room like she was learning its edges. Cereal's in the cupboard, he said softly, gesturing with his chin. Milk's in the fridge. She nodded once, crossed to the cupboard, and pulled down a bowl. The movement was deliberate, almost too careful, like she was afraid to put anything back in the wrong place. When the milk poured, the faint glug was the loudest sound in the room. They ate in near silence. The clink of her spoon against the ceramic, the only rhythm between them. Caleb didn't push conversation. In his experience, trust grew best in the space he didn't crowd. Instead, he let his eyes wander over the kitchen, the worn grooves on the pine table where years of elbows had rested, the sunlight catching dust motes above the sink. The faded calendar still stuck on a month 3 years gone. After breakfast, Grace rinsed her bowl without being asked. The sight of it, her small hands turning the dish under the tap, wiping it with the old dish rag, stirred something in him he hadn't expected. Not pride exactly, but a quiet gratitude for the small proof that she wasn't just passing through. Later, he took her out to the porch. The boards sagged in the middle, and the paint had peeled down to gray wood, but the view stretched all the way to the tree line where the morning mist still clung. He'd set 2 mugs on the railing, coffee for him, hot chocolate for her. She held the warm cup between both hands, breathing in the steam, eyes following the slow movement of the fog. This is quiet, she said finally, The first real words of the day. Yeah, he answered. Take some getting used to. She didn't reply, but she didn't seem unsettled by it. Her shoulders had dropped a little, as if the weight she carried shifted just enough to breathe differently. The rest of the morning passed in small chores. Caleb fixed the loose hinge on the back door while Grace explored the yard, running her fingers over the split-rail fence, kneeling to inspect the small garden bed overrun with weeds. At one point, he glanced up to find her standing near the oak tree, head tilted back, watching a squirrel pick its way along a high branch. She stood there for a long time, unmoving, as if memorizing how stillness could be its own kind of safety. Inside, he laid out a few things for her in the spare room. A stack of books he thought she might like, a desk lamp that still worked if you jiggled the cord just right, and a quilt he'd used on winter nights. He didn't say they were hers, but when she wandered in and saw them, she touched the quilt's edge and left it folded exactly as she'd found it. By late morning, sunlight had burned through the mist, painting the kitchen in a pale gold. Grace sat at the table with a pencil, sketching in a battered notebook. Caleb recognized the habit. It was the same focus he'd seen in soldiers cleaning their rifles or folding their uniforms just so. A way of building order when the rest of the world had been chaos. He didn't look at what she was drawing. He figured if she wanted him to see, she'd turn the page toward him. When noon came, she closed the notebook, set it aside, and without prompting, began making sandwiches, peanut butter and jelly, the bread cut diagonally. She slid one across to him, and, for a moment, it was almost like they'd done this 100 times before. After lunch, they sat on the porch again, listening to the wind and the trees. No talk of the fire, or Ross, or the kind of truths that could undo the thin peace they'd begun to build. Just the creak of the rocking chair under Caleb, the slow sip of her hot chocolate, and the steady awareness that this was the first morning of something neither of them could yet name. It wasn't a clean slate, not with the past trailing behind them like smoke, but it was a start, and in the quiet between them, Caleb thought maybe that was enough for now. The days that followed settled into a kind of rhythm. Not perfect, not polished, but steady enough that Caleb began to feel the difference in the air. Trust, he knew, wasn't something you woke up to one morning like the sun after a storm. It came in glimpses, in small, almost invisible movements. The first was the door. For the first 3 nights, Grace had closed her bedroom door tight, the latch clicking as if to mark a boundary she couldn't yet name. On the 4th night, Caleb noticed it was left ajar, just an inch or two, enough for the hallway light to slip in. He didn't comment, just walked past, careful not to make the floorboards complain under his weight. The second came in the kitchen. She had been moving around in her careful way, putting the milk back in the fridge, rinsing a plate, when he heard her hum, soft, almost lost under the tap's hiss. It was nothing like a song, more like a piece of one remembered without words. But it was the first sound he'd heard from her that wasn't meant to answer or defend. Caleb didn't say anything about that either. Words had a way of making moments like that shrink back into themselves. On a Saturday morning, he found her at the kitchen table, a handful of pencils scattered around her sketchbook. She didn't pull the cover closed when he walked in. Instead, she kept shading the corner of a small drawing, a fence line, an oak tree, and the sagging porch of his house. In the lower corner, there was a figure that might have been him, seated on the porch steps, coffee mug in hand. "You've got the porch just right," he said, careful to keep his voice low, without the heavy praise that could make her retreat. She didn't answer, but she didn't hide the drawing, either. That was enough. The biggest shift came one late afternoon, after they'd been outside stacking kindling. A cold front had moved in, sharpening the air, and Grace had pulled his old Army field jacket tight around her shoulders. She was smaller than the jacket made her look, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. He caught himself wanting to adjust it for her, but stopped, remembering that too much, too soon, could close whatever small door she'd started to open. As they stacked the last pieces of wood, she glanced over her shoulder toward the woods and said quietly, "You can hear owls out here at night." It wasn't an invitation for him to agree or a test to see if he knew. It was simply a piece of her world offered into the space between them. That night, she left her sketchbook on a coffee table, half open to a new page. He didn't touch it, but from where he sat in the armchair, he could see the beginnings of a drawing. 2 mugs on a railing, steam curling into the morning air. Small signs. He told himself, that's how trust grows. You don't demand it. You hold still, make room for it to step closer. On the 7th morning, the jacket was gone from the hook by the door. He found her outside, sitting cross-legged on the porch in the early light, wearing it while she watched the road curve away into the trees. She didn't turn when she heard him, but she said, "The frost makes the grass look silver." He came and stood beside her, hands in his pockets, and for a long time they just looked out at the road. The frost would melt soon enough. But the moment stayed, quiet and unforced. One more thread in something neither of them was rushing to name. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a promise. But in the soft edges of her voice and the space she allowed him to share, Caleb felt the truth of it. She was beginning to believe she was safe here. And maybe, just maybe, so was he. It was the kind of afternoon that belonged to late October, light thin enough to make the edges of things softer, the air holding just enough warmth to let you forget that winter was on its way. Caleb had taken Grace to the small park at the edge of town, the one with the faded green benches and the playground that creaked in the wind. He wasn't sure what he expected them to do there. Maybe he just needed to be outside, somewhere that didn't have walls and ceilings to remind them both of the nights when the world had felt smaller than a locked room. The park wasn't crowded. A pair of boys in hooded sweatshirts chased each other around the swings, their laughter carrying in short bursts before it was swallowed by the open space. A woman in a red scarf sat at one of the picnic tables, reading a book and pausing every now and then to push her hair back from her face. Grace wandered ahead, her hands tucked in the pockets of his field jacket, head tilted as if she were listening to something the rest of the world couldn't hear. Caleb stayed a few paces behind. He had learned not to crowd her, just let the distance be what it needed to be. She walked toward the pond at the center of the park, its surface a sheet of shifting light where the trees leaned in. Leaves floated in slow circles, their colors dimmed but still holding the last stubborn reds and golds of the season. She stopped near the low fence and stood there, watching a pair of ducks paddle in, their movements cutting quiet V-shapes in the water. Caleb joined her, leaning on the railing, the wood cool under his palms. They stayed like that for a while. No conversation, just the kind of silence that could either be heavy or light, depending on how you held it. Then she asked it. Her voice was soft, almost like she was afraid the question might be too loud for the air around them. "Why did you come back for me?" Caleb didn't look at her right away. Questions like that didn't want a fast answer. They wanted room. He watched the ducks disappear into the reeds and felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He could have told her about the night of the fire, how instinct had taken over, how there hadn't been time to think. He could have said it was what anyone would have done, but they both knew not everyone would have. Instead, he said quietly, "Because someone should." She didn't respond at first. Her gaze stayed on the water, and he wondered if she was sorting his answer into the boxes in her mind. Truth, half-truth, or something else entirely. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wood smoke from a house nearby. Somewhere behind them, the old metal slide groaned as the wind nudged it. Finally, she spoke again. No one's ever come back before. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't even sad in the way he expected. It was just a fact laid out between them like a stone. Caleb wanted to reach out, to put his hand over hers on the railing. But he didn't. Not yet. Trust, he reminded himself, was still finding its footing. They stayed there until the ducks reappeared, cutting across the pond in the opposite direction. Grace shifted slightly closer to him, her shoulder brushing his arm for just a second before she stepped back. On the walk back to the truck, she didn't trail behind like she usually did. She kept pace with him, eyes forward, hands still buried in her pockets. When they passed the row of benches, she glanced at one of them and asked, "Can we come here again sometime?" He didn't smile, not the broad kind, anyway, but there was a warmth that uncurled in his chest. "Yeah," he said, "we can." It was a small thing, a question asked, an answer given. But for Caleb, it was the first time he felt like she wasn't just walking beside him because she had to. She was choosing to, and that choice, quiet as it was, felt like the start of something they might both be able to believe in. The sky had folded itself into the colors of early evening, soft lavender at the edges. A pale gold stretched thin across the horizon. Caleb and Grace walked the narrow sidewalk back toward the house, the rhythm of their steps almost in sync. The town was quiet at this hour. Porch lights flickered on in slow succession, each one throwing a small halo into the cooling air. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and then stopped, as if remembering there was nothing worth saying. Caleb carried the brown paper bag from the corner store in one hand, milk, bread, and the small pack of crayons Grace had lingered over in the aisle. She hadn't asked for them. She hadn't asked for anything. But he'd seen her fingers tracing the cardboard edges, and it had felt like the easiest decision in the world to slip them onto the counter with the rest. They were halfway down their street when she spoke again, her voice so low it was almost lost to the shuffle of their steps. "I think I know why you came back for me." He slowed, not because he wanted to interrupt her thought, but because the words seemed to deserve more space between them. "Yeah." She nodded, eyes still forward. "Because you knew I'd be alone." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an accusation. It was something more fragile, an offering maybe. Caleb let the silence stretch, the sound of leaves scratching across the sidewalk filling the gap. He wanted to tell her that he had been alone too, for longer than he cared to measure, and that maybe they had recognized something in each other before either of them had put it into words. But he learned not every truth needed to be spoken right away. Some could rest a while, like seeds under frost, waiting for the right season. When they reached the gate, he shifted the bag to his left hand and held the other out, not in the deliberate parental way of guiding a child across the street, but simply because it felt right. She glanced down at it, hesitation passing like a shadow across her face. Then she slipped her hand into his. Her palm was small and warm, her fingers curling tentatively at first, then more firmly. Caleb didn't tighten his grip, just let their hands find a natural weight together. It was nothing like the rehearsed handshakes of military greetings or the quick, polite touches of neighbors. This was quieter. This was real. They stood there for a moment before pushing the gate open. The hinges squealed, the sound familiar now, and they walked up the short path to the porch. A moth circled the light above the door, tapping its wings in soft, erratic beats. Inside, the house held the day's leftover warmth. Caleb set the groceries on the counter while Grace wandered to the small table by the window. The crayons were still in the bag. She pulled them out and turned the box over in her hands, reading the colors printed on the side. "You can use them after dinner," he said quietly, and she nodded, a faint curve at the corner of her mouth. As he started unpacking the rest, he thought about her earlier words, about knowing she'd be alone. She was right in a way, but it wasn't just that he knew. It was that he couldn't let it stay that way. Later, as they ate in the dim light of the kitchen, her hand brushed his again when she reached for the bread. It was quick, almost accidental, but she didn't pull away immediately. And when she did, her eyes lifted to meet his, steady for a moment before she looked down at her plate. That night, after she'd gone to bed and the house had settled into its small creaks and sighs, Caleb sat at the table alone. The memory of her hand in his lingered, not in the way a soldier remembers the grip of a rifle, but in the way a man remembers the first sign that maybe, just maybe, he has found someone worth standing still for. It wasn't a grand moment. There had been no sweeping music, no words to stamp into history, just two people walking home, and a decision made in the quiet, one hand reaching, the other choosing to meet it. And for Caleb, that was enough to carry him through the night. The morning began without fanfare. Gray light seeped through the kitchen curtains, carrying with it the faint smell of rain that had passed some time before dawn. Caleb was already up, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee warming his hand. The calendar on the wall marked the date in neat block letters, September 14th, and below it, in Grace's uneven handwriting, were the words, "My birthday." It had been her doing, writing it down like that weeks ago. No balloons, no glitter pens. Just pencil lead pressing into paper with the quiet certainty of someone who didn't expect much, but wanted to make sure it was remembered. Caleb had spent the past few days thinking about what a birthday meant when you were 6. He remembered his own, spent in backyards, chasing after cousins, cake icing staining his fingers. For Grace, the memories might be thinner, scattered. He wasn't going to fill them with noise. He wanted this one to be a day she could carry without it hurting. On the table, he laid out the simple things. A small chocolate cake from the bakery downtown, its surface smooth except for the 6 pale blue candles waiting to be lit. A stack of plates, a paper-wrapped box no bigger than his palm. Nothing extravagant, but in the center of the table, he'd placed a vase with 3 wild sunflowers he'd cut from the patch behind the house, their gold faces turned toward the window as if they knew the day was meant for her. Grace padded into the kitchen still in her socks, hair loose from sleep, rubbing at her eyes. She paused when she saw the table, her gaze traveling over each item like she was trying to decide what to touch first. "Morning," Caleb said, keeping his voice easy. "You're just in time. I was about to make pancakes." She slid into a chair, fingers brushing the vase. "You picked these?" He nodded. "They reminded me of you." Her mouth twitched at that, half a smile, half something else. She didn't ask about the cake. Maybe she didn't want to call attention to it yet, like it might vanish if she did. They cooked together, Grace stirring the batter while Caleb flipped each pancake onto a warm plate. She worked carefully, as if the day itself depended on her getting the lumps out. When they sat down to eat, she was quiet, but there was a lightness to the way she moved, a small, unguarded hum under her breath. By the time afternoon came, the rain clouds had broken apart, letting the sunlight spill across the yard. Caleb carried the cake outside, setting it on the old picnic table that leaned slightly to one side. The air smelled of wet grass and was warmed by the sun. They didn't have a crowd, just the two of them and Mrs. Alden from next door, who brought over a jar of her homemade strawberry jam as a gift. 6 years old, she said warmly, ruffling Grace's hair before retreating back to her porch. Caleb lit the candles, the small flames trembling in the soft breeze. Grace leaned forward, elbows on the table, her face caught between concentration and wonder. "Make a wish," he said. She closed her eyes. The wind tugged gently at the hem of her shirt, and for a moment, Caleb wondered if she would wish for something he couldn't give her, something from before. But when she opened her eyes again, she blew out the candles in a single breath, and the look on her face was not longing but relief. They cut the cake. Chocolate smudged at the corners of her mouth, her laughter slipping out more easily now. After the plates were cleared, Caleb handed her the small wrapped box. She turned it over once before peeling back the paper, revealing a simple silver locket on a chain. Inside was a tiny photograph, Grace on the left, him on the right, taken just 2 weeks earlier when they'd gone to the park. They weren't smiling at the camera, but at each other. She held it in her palm for a long moment before looking up. "Can I wear it now?" He fastened it around her neck, the clasp catching the sunlight. It lay against her collarbone like it belonged there. As the day faded toward evening, they stayed outside, the air cooling around them. Grace sat on the porch steps drawing with the crayons he'd bought her days ago, while Caleb sipped coffee that had long since gone cold. There was no big party, no noise, no pile of gifts. But in the quiet of that 6th birthday, there was something whole. Caleb could feel it in the steady weight of the day, the way Grace looked at him without flinching, the way her small hand had brushed his arm when she passed him the cake knife. For the first time in a long while, he realized he hadn't thought about what was missing, only about what was here. And maybe that was the best gift either of them could have given the other. The evening crept in without ceremony. It didn't fall suddenly like a curtain. It seeped in, slow, patient, spilling blue shadows over the yard until the last of the sun was caught only in the upper branches of the elm out back. Caleb sat in the porch chair, elbows resting on his knees, a mug cup between his hands. It wasn't for drinking anymore. The coffee inside had gone tepid hours ago, but the weight of it felt like an anchor, something to hold on to. Grace was somewhere in the grass, chasing after the drifting seeds of a dandelion she'd blown apart. Her laughter came in small bursts, thin, breathless threads that tangled with the faint hum of cicadas in the trees. The sound made Caleb's shoulders loosen, but it also settled deep in his chest like a reminder of just how rare this was. A day where nothing had to be won, defended, or survived. The porch boards under his boots still held a trace of the afternoon's warmth. Above, the screen door leaned slightly open, creaking whenever the wind shifted. It was the kind of house sound you stopped noticing after a while, until you'd been away from homes for years, sleeping under roofs that didn't belong to you, where the only night noises were the ticking of pipes or the distant hum of generators. Grace wandered back toward the steps, barefoot now, holding something cupped in her hands. She stopped just short of him, peering at her small treasure, a firefly, blinking weakly against the fading light. "Looks tired," Caleb said softly, not because he wanted to break the quiet, but because the quiet between them could bear a little weight now. She nodded, kneeling to let the insect crawl onto the porch rail. They both watched it for a long minute, its pulse of light sinking, in some strange way, with the rhythm of their own breathing. When it finally lifted off and vanished into the dusk, Grace sat on the step below him without a word. It was the kind of stillness that would have unnerved him once. In the field, stillness meant danger. The absence of movement was often just the breath before something broke loose. But here, in this narrow gap between day and night, it meant something else. It meant there was no need to fill the air with words or movement. Caleb let his gaze travel past the yard to where the old fence leaned into the road, the paint long faded to gray. Beyond it, the street was empty, the world holding its own breath. Somewhere a dog barked, then stopped. Even the cicadas seemed to pause. He felt the shift in himself before he realized it. The drop of his shoulders, the unclenching in his jaw, the way his thoughts, usually restless and circling, began to settle like leaves in still water. Grace leaned her head against his shin, not pressing for attention, just being there. The simple contact was grounding. He reached down, resting his palm lightly on her hair, and left it there. The moment stretched, unbroken. He thought of how much of his life had been spent moving from one base to another, one assignment to the next, measuring time in departures and returns. But here, there was no departure scheduled, just the slow drift of the evening, the lamp on the porch waiting to be turned on, the sound of Grace's breathing evening out as she relaxed. A moth circled the porch light once before disappearing into the dark. The mug in Caleb's hands had cooled completely, but he didn't set it down. He wasn't ready to move, not yet. He didn't know how long they sat like that. Long enough for the first stars to appear. Long enough for Grace to get up, fetch her sketchbook, and settle back on the steps. Her small body framed in the soft light spilling from the kitchen window. She drew without hurry, the scratch of her pencil a steady counterpoint to the quiet. Caleb found himself memorizing the scene, not in grand strokes, but in details, the way her bare toes curled slightly against the wood grain, the faint smear of chocolate at the corner of her mouth from the cake, the locket resting just above her collarbone, catching the last hint of daylight. It struck him then, without warning, that this stillness was not empty. It was full, crowded, even, with the things he hadn't dared hope for when he'd come back. A place that felt like his, a child who no longer flinched at his presence. A day that ended without loss. When Grace finally looked up, the porch lamp casting her face in gold, she didn't speak. She just gave him a small, almost absent smile before returning to her drawing. And Caleb, without thinking, smiled back. The air was cooler now, the scent of damp earth rising from the yard. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the shape of the moment settle into place. Not as a memory, not yet, but as something he could keep, the kind of thing that could remind him, on harder days, that there were reasons to stay. And for now, staying was enough. By the time night settled over the town, the streets had thinned to nothing but the faint hiss of wind threading through the trees. Out on the northern edge, where the road turned to gravel and the houses stood farther apart, a small wooden house glowed with the soft amber of an old filament bulb. It wasn't the kind of light that demanded attention. It was a quiet, steady light, the kind you noticed only if you were looking for a sign that someone was still awake. Inside, the air carried a calm that came from people simply existing together. Grace sat in a worn armchair near the front window, her legs curled slightly beneath her. A book rested open on her lap, its pages catching the lamplight in warm tones. Her eyes moved slowly, not out of fatigue, but because the words were a place she went when the real world felt uncertain. Every so often, when the curtains stirred with the wind, she paused, not looking at anything in particular, before returning to the page, as if to confirm the room was still holding her in place. On the floor, Noah sat cross-legged on a faded gray rug. Wooden blocks, each with its own chips and scratches, were scattered around him. He was building a tower, stacking each piece with the care of someone who understood how easily things could fall apart. His little fingers hovered before setting a block down, aligning it so precisely you could almost hear the silence lean in to watch. When one piece shifted off balance, he froze, breathed deeply, and nudged it into place. The tower rose slowly, stubborn against the pull of gravity. In the far corner, Caleb sat at a small table, bent over an old radio. A half-circle of tools surrounded him. Pliers, screwdrivers, a tin of mismatched screws. The light above his work caught the rough skin of his hands, moving with deliberate precision. Every few minutes he stopped, tilting the radio closer, listening to the faint static crackle through the speaker. There was no urgency, no particular station he hoped to find. He only wanted it to work again, to speak again, even if all it gave back was a voice lost in the noise. They were three separate figures, each in their own quiet orbit, Grace in her pages, Noah in his tower. Caleb in the circuitry of a machine that belonged to another time. Yet a thin, invisible thread bound them together. It was in the sound of wood clicking softly against wood, in the whisper of a turning page, in the muted clink of metal against screw. It was in the slow rhythm of their breathing, all falling into a shared, unspoken pace. Outside, the town lay under a blanket of stillness. The few street lamps that worked cast narrow cones of light, leaving long stretches of road to the dark. Other houses had gone quiet for the night, their windows black. But this house, the one at the edge, remained lit. It didn't burn bright in defiance of the night. It glowed the way a lighthouse might, not loud but certain. For Caleb, the war had taught him that not all shelters came with walls. Sometimes it was simply a presence, a weight beside you that said, without words, you are not alone. In that room, with the hum of the lamp, the scattered blocks, the soft turning of a page, and the low, patient work of bringing a radio back to life, that presence was undeniable. The house did not ask anything of them. It only held them, Grace in her chair, Noah with his careful tower, Caleb at his table, and promised, in a way only light can promise, that for tonight, they were staying. The house settled into the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty. Outside, the night leaned heavy against the windows, a soft curtain of crickets and distant wind pushing through the trees. Inside, the lamplight caught on the edges of things, the curve of Grace's hair as she turned another page, the steady line of Noah's shoulders as he concentrated on balancing one last wooden block, Caleb's hands moving slowly over the small radio guts spread out on the table. It was the kind of evening where nothing needed to be said because everything was understood. Grace shifted in her chair, the faint creak blending with the soft clink of wood on wood as Noah finally placed the top block. His small exhale of satisfaction was barely audible, but Caleb caught it. He didn't look up right away. Instead, he let the sound settle in him, the way you hold on to something fragile without moving too quickly. When the radio clicked softly in his hands, static whispered through the speaker, thin, almost shy. Caleb adjusted the dial until a faint tune emerged. Some old country song from a station far enough away that it sounded like it was coming through a dream. Grace didn't glance over, but he could see her mouth form the shadow of a smile. Noah leaned closer to the sound, the tower of blocks wobbling slightly, as if even they wanted to listen. They stayed like that for a long moment, each in their own small world, tethered by something invisible. Caleb thought about how fragile these nights were, how easily the light could go out, how quickly walls could feel cold again. He didn't want to think about the flames from that day, or the way Noah's voice had cracked when he spoke those two words. But memory has a way of moving like smoke. It slips in, even when you shut every door. The boy glanced at him then, just a flicker of eye contact before looking back at the blocks. It was enough. There was no promise spoken, no declaration made. But in that small exchange, Caleb felt the weight of an unspoken truth, that as long as he was breathing, he wouldn't walk away. Not from Noah, not from Grace, not from this fragile thing they were building one quiet night at a time. Grace closed her book gently, setting it on the side table. She stood, touched the back of Noah's head in passing, and disappeared down the short hallway. Caleb heard the faint rustle of blankets in the other room. Noah stayed where he was, dismantling the tower block by block, placing each piece neatly in the box without hurry. When the last block was put away, he stood by the table for a moment, as if uncertain where to go next. Caleb turned the radio off, the silence that followed somehow fuller than the music. He reached out, not a command, not even an invitation, just a hand resting open on the edge of the table. Noah hesitated, then stepped closer, placing his small hand over Caleb's. The weight was barely there, but it carried more than either of them could name. The night outside pressed closer, but the house stayed warm. The light pooled softly over their joined hands, and neither of them moved. There would be other nights, other silences, maybe other storms. But for now, in this small house at the edge of town, a promise lived in the space between their breaths, steady, unspoken, and enough. Some stories don't end with a grand gesture or a final word. They end like this, a quiet night in a small house. The steady breath of people who've found their way back to something worth holding. No headlines, no applause. Just light in the windows, warmth in the walls. And the kind of promises that live in the silence between two people who've decided to stay. In towns like this, you learn that healing isn't a moment. It's a string of evenings, a handful of ordinary days, and the choice to keep showing up. Maybe you've been there, in the waiting, in the wondering, in the wordless place where trust begins again. If you have, you'll understand why some promises are better left unspoken. And maybe you'll tell us, in your own quiet way, what promise you've kept without saying it out loud.